back on Tuesday.
Oh, good evening, all. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes. There are people connecting to the webinar, so give people a chance to get into the site.
Hello, Wayne. How are you?
Oh, good, thank you. I think that's Lou, is it? Yes.
That's me. I'll just mute myself and sit here.
Just wait for one more minute and then we'll crack into the presentation. All right, I think what we'll do is we'll crack into the presentation now. It's just 3 minutes after 6. And so I just firstly just wish to welcome you all to this third of 3 webinars we've been holding on some really significant, I think we've just, hang on a second, I think just changed that, the presentation slide. It's gone to, let's go back. Yeah, just go back, yeah. Okay, let's just leave it there. So yeah, thank you for coming along and welcome to the webinar. So this is the third of 3 webinars, and this is some really significant planning changes on the way for Waipa. So yeah, just next slide, thank you. So my name is Wayne Allen, and I'm Council's Group Manager, District Growth and Regulatory Services. Tonight we're aiming to do 2 things, give you an overview of some really complex changes that have been forced upon us, changes that we think have the potential to fundamentally change parts of Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki's residential areas. And secondly, and most importantly, we want to answer as many questions as possible about those changes. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but I did want to cover some housekeeping first. Everybody apart from the presenters on tonight's webinar will be muted. Otherwise, it's just simply impossible to hear everybody. Please be aware that tonight's webinar is being recorded and a link will go onto our webinar tomorrow, on our website tomorrow. And questions you submit in the chat during the webinar are not private. You'll probably find on our website now, there's the first webinar that we conducted. In terms of questions, we've been encouraging people to send in questions early, and we've received some for this webinar in advance as well. So thank you for those. And during tonight's webinar, you're welcome to ask more questions using the chat function. So can you go to the next slide, please? And the next slide, thank you. But before we start, I did want to reiterate a couple of things. There's a lot of information about this issue already on our website, including a whole series of questions and answers that we're continually adding to. So please take a note of the web address above, www.waipadc.govt.nz/plan change 26. Jump in if you haven't already and have a good look around. Secondly, we've sent out a brochure to our residents in our district in the mail. If you haven't received it or you want to have a look, just go onto the website and have a look and grab a copy, or grab a copy from the council offices. And thirdly, just take a note of the email address that we've got there, districtplan@waipadc.govt.nz. If at the end of the webinar you have more questions, send them here and our team will be happy to pick those up and respond. So just speaking of the next, of our team, just the next slide, thanks. So the key staff that are available tonight, obviously myself, and we've got David Topman, our Principal Policy Advisor here tonight. Tony Quickfall, our Manager of District Plan and Growth, couldn't make it this evening. We've got Joe Cook-Monroe. So Joe's been principally the architect in preparing the plan change information. It's been quite a lot of complex work that's been undertaken to do that. So Joe, you've done a really fantastic job in the work you've done to date on the significant time pressures. I appreciate that. And then we've got Tony Coots as well, our Principal Engineer of Growth. And Tony is our guru on infrastructural issues. So if we get questions relating to infrastructural matters, Tony's the man who'll be assisting and answering it. Behind the scenes, we've also got some people collating the questions and making sure the webinar runs smoothly. We've allowed about an hour for the webinar, but can be flexible depending on the number of questions that we get. So let's just get into it. Next slide, please. So we've indicated here that change is coming. They're coming because we've had new laws that are forcing changes to the Waipā District Plan. These include the Resource Management Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. That came into effect toward the end of last year, and it required Tier 1 growth councils to notify a plan change by August this year. We're a Tier 1 growth council here at Waipā District. So our plan change is responding to this new law, and we've called it Plan Change 26, our residential zone intensification. We've met the legal requirement to notify the plan change within August. The new laws are aimed to address the national housing crisis and apply to big growth cities such as Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton, Rotorua and Tauranga and so forth. Plus, it has picked up some smaller towns like Te Awamutu and Cambridge and Kiki. And those include our residential zones in those towns. We are, as I say, we are Tier 1 Growth Council under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. There are other parts of our district that are not affected directly by this plan change. And those include the rural zone, our large lot zones or rural residential areas, if you can call it that way, generally where there's no wastewater connections, our industrial areas, our commercial areas, our town belts and reserve areas are not affected, nor is our Karapiro residential zone. there was a requirement for a 5,000 population threshold, and Karapiro was not included in that. I'd just like to pause there on the slide and just highlight a really important point. It's really important to note that none of the new medium density residential standards will have legal effect once the plan change has been notified, and we've notified it already. This is because all of the new medium density residential zones in Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu are proposed to have a qualifying matter overlay over them. I'll talk a little bit more about qualifying matters shortly. So at the time of the plan change notification, nothing will change in terms of what is a permitted activity. The current district plan provisions will continue to apply. There may be expectations from some developers or landowners that they'll be able to build 3 houses on a site 3 stories high within the ambit of the legislation as a permitted activity. That will not be the case at Waipa, given, as I say, we've got qualifying matters over our residential zones in Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki. Next slide, please. So in practical terms, there is a national housing shortage. The changes aim to see more houses built faster in high growth areas. Central government wants landowners to be able to build, as I say, 3 houses up to 3 stories high to a maximum height of 11 metres without the need for a resource consent. I'll just pause there and reflect on other controls that were in the legislation. The legislation provided for road front yard setbacks at 1.5 metres. Under the Waipā District Plan, it currently varies between 3 metres to 7.5 metres in our residential areas. The side yard setbacks under the legislation, 1 metre, including side yards and rear yards. In our district plan, it would vary between 2 metres to 5 metres. Site coverage under the legislation would be 50% maximum, which is a little bit more onerous than our current plan, which is 40%. Impermeable surfaces at 60% maximum, whereas the Waipā District Plan would be 60% the same maximum, except in Cambridge North, which is 45%. As I've highlighted on the slide, there's no minimum sizes for residential subdivisions within certain conditions. It's not the case under our current district plan, where minimums do apply. Another big change under the legislation, as I said, is the height of 11 metres. Generally in our district plan at the moment for residential zones, it varies around 9 metres. Another significant change is the height to boundary, the recession planes essentially, that provide sunlight to neighbouring properties. Under the legislation, it's a 60-degree recession plane from 4 metres above ground level. A lot more flexible than our current district plan, which is 45 degrees north and 28 degrees south with a 2.7 metre above boundary, which relates to our sun angles here. There are other controls as well in terms of outdoor living and outdoor space, but I won't go into any more. So as I say, essentially it means bigger, higher houses closer to boundaries. It's important to note that building standards must still be met. There's no substandard housing. Building consents will still be required. And I'll also point out that, although it's not part of this piece of legislation or the council plan change, council cannot require on-site car parks. excludes accessible parking, but for any developments, including residential, there was a government mandate in 2020. So these car parking controls have already been removed from the district plan. So you could find that people could build 3 houses, 3 stories high, and not require any car parks, not put any car parks on the site. Council couldn't require those car parks to be on site. Next slide, please. So this is a slide about the qualifying matters. I talked earlier about it. I guess this is more NU Resource Management Act technical language being used in this legislation. Qualifying matters are matters which allow for modifications to the new planning rules. The legislation does not allow for an area to be excluded from the medium density residential standards. So that is why in our plan change, we have created a whole new section 2A, which is our medium density residential zone for Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki. And councils can add qualifying matters, but there must be very robust justification for it. In essence, the new planning rules will apply unless there's a very specific and robust reason for them not to. So essentially, if we didn't have qualifying matters, then these activities would be permitted. We, however, do have qualifying matters, and we think in Waipa there is sufficient reasons to not apply the medium density residential standards in our residential zones through these qualifying matters. So let's look at the qualifying matters, the relevant qualifying matters now. So next slide, please. So as discussed, we've legally have to notify a plan change to recognise the new legislation. That's our plan change 26. We recognise Te Tura Whamana o Te Awa Waikato, which is the vision and strategy for the Waikato River. That is a qualifying matter. It was put in through submissions that were made by Waipa, Hamilton City and Waikato and Tainui to the Select Committee. And the legislation was amended to put that in as a qualifying matter, and quite rightly. Without the right infrastructure, particularly for stormwater and wastewater, an increase in housing does have the potential to adversely affect the Waikato River and the other water bodies in the Waikato catchment within Waipa. We also acknowledge that Waipa's current infrastructure, our roads, our pipes, does not have the capacity to cope with a huge and fast increase in housing. That is the 3 houses per site. We believe Waipa should only have 2 houses, not 3 on each site, importantly as a permitted activity. That's what the current district plan is. Financial contributions from developers are the primary tool to fund unplanned infrastructure. A lot of this new infrastructure that will be needed is not currently planned within the long-term plan. That's Council's financial documents to secure the source of funding to fund infrastructure. We have put in the plan change financial contributions and updated that section. But we add that this has added another complication, is we normally take development contributions under the Local Government Act for developments. Financial contributions are imposed under the Resource Management Act. Any contributions applied on developments will now need to have regard to both funding contribution mechanisms. Next slide, please. Other issues. Historic heritage and character are both qualifying matters. Retention of existing character clusters and character streets are to be maintained. There's proposed to add new houses into character clusters, and I'll come to that shortly. There's no change has been proposed to our heritage items under the plan change. Protected trees, heritage and cultural sites, designations and national grid are already in our Waipā District Plan. They remain protected as existing qualifying matters. Similarly, significant natural areas, cultural landscapes, the Waikato River and public open spaces remain protected. Next slide, please. Other changes. An additional 91 houses identified as character houses will be added into new or existing character cluster areas. We did send separate letters out to those landowners advising them of that. Essentially, for those houses, a restricted discretionary resource consent will be required to make changes to the character. They are not heritage listed buildings. And I urge, if landowners are concerned about that change, to lodge a submission on the plan change. As discussed, we've made amendments to the existing financial contributions in the district plan. And now we'll be able to be charged in respect of residential amenities such as street trees. And that'll be based on, and impacts on the Waikato River, and that'll be based on a per bedroom or per dwelling basis. There's no amendments being proposed to the existing heritage schedule in the district plan, which lists historic heritage buildings and items. Next slide, please. The changes we anticipate. We may not see wholesale housing intensification fast, but we will see changes to our towns if the medium residential standards are applied. Property owners may add on granny flats or tiny homes without needing resource consents if they meet all the standards under the current district plan, commonly referred as second houses, granny flats. Developers may seek comprehensive multi-storey townhouse developments. Developers will be expected to pay for intense infrastructural upgrades, but we do not expect this to cover the entire cost. That's one of the challenges in this plan change, is identifying the full cost of implementation when you get this level of development occurring anywhere within a residential zone. And the intensification changes are expected to drive costs up for ratepayers. But I just want to re-emphasize again that the plan change in terms of the medium residential standards do not have effect at the time of notification because we have qualifying matters. People will still need to apply for resource consents if they want to step outside of the current district plan provisions. Next slide, please. So next steps. So the first box there, the public notification. So that's been completed. The submission period, an extended submission period to the end of September, 30 September. Submissions that seek to amend or delete the new density standards, unfortunately, will be out of scope. Those are the density standards that are in the legislation. That is not usual practice. However, you can lodge submissions on the qualifying matters that Council has put into its plan change. Under this process, submissions will be considered by an independent hearing panel of hearing commissioners. We've set up a hearings panel that is similar to hear the submissions to the plan changes for Hamilton City and Waipā District Council. The commissioners, the hearing commissioners, will make recommendations to the council after considering the plan change and the submissions. If council agrees with the recommendations, it notifies the decision. But if council disagrees with the recommendations, it can present an alternative view. And that would go to the Minister for the Environment for the final decision. There's no right of appeal under this piece of legislation. I'd point out too that the new rules will come into effect from the date of decisions. So we expect that hearings will take place next year. To hear the substantive submissions, probably we haven't got any fixed times yet, but probably you're looking maybe around the April, May, June sort of period. But keep an eye out on the website because we will be publishing the Commissioner's directions. And I know they've just released a direction today or yesterday. So we'll be putting that on the website shortly. Now that will have all the detail around the hearings process and the expectations on councils and submitters presenting at the hearings. Next slide, please. So how to make a submission. So submissions can be made at www.waipadc.govt.nz//have your say. I just point out that it's really important that you use the appropriate submission form, Form 5. So an email will not suffice. You've got to use the appropriate form. You'll find all that information on the website. In addition, would highlight that government has funded a free independent friend of submitter service to provide advice on the submission process. The friend of submitter cannot write the submissions for you, regrettably, but can advise on the process. If you need assistance on the submission process, please contact the friend of the submitter. And the information on the friend of submitter is there on the slide, including the phone number and an email address that you can contact. You should find all of that information on our website as well. As said earlier, the submissions period closes at 5 p.m. Friday, 30 September of this year. And next slide, please. So I think that was the end of the presentation. And we'll crack into some questions that we have received. And please feel free to write any further questions you might have in the chat box and we'll try and answer them. If we are unable to answer, we'll try and get the responses on the website in the next few days. So the questions that we have got so far. And I'll be looking at my screen as the new questions come up. So the first question was, what is the likelihood that council can prevent this new legislation affecting Cambridge through the qualifying matters of infrastructure, i.e. infrastructure not adequate to support housing intensification? So I'll ask some members of the panel to come forward. and just respond. So Tony, do you want to have a go at this one?
Yeah, sure, Wayne. So that's essentially what we're trying to find out through the hearing process, is our probability on acceptance. We've got quite a unique circumstance of qualifying matters with the likes of Te Ture Whaimana and protection of the river. That's quite unique to the district and also the likes of Hamilton and other areas in Waikato. So that's something that can't just be blanketly revoked, given how much effort was put in place to get that system in line. So I feel that we've got a very robust case that's based on very solid data sets that prove, essentially effects. And as we work through those processes with the hearings and getting our sort of reports further detailed and refined into that matter, we should have a pretty good qualifying case.
Thanks for that, Tony. Joe, do you have anything further to add? Since you helped draft the plan change up.
Okay. Unfortunately, it's not a matter of preventing the legislation. The legislation is there. We do have to apply it. What we are trying to do is to modify the requirements to a level that does no damage to Cambridge, Kihi, and Te Awamutu. And that means staying within the limits of what our infrastructure network is telling us it can handle.
All right, thank you, Joe. The next question. So David, this one's for you. Given that plants counteract CO2, is there a way to ensure plants are part of people's residential space, e.g. street plantings, rooftop plantings?
Thank you, Wayne. Not directly, not under the district plan, but what we do have in the district plan is a requirement for permeable surfaces on each residential lot. Wayne, you talked about this in terms of the coverage, site coverage aspects of the plan change. So we do have a requirement for permeable surfaces, and that's partly to dealing with stormwater, but it is also with the interest of providing for planted surfaces in our residential areas. Now, with the plan change 26, of course, that's going to reduce because there's provision for 50% coverage, but we are keen that our design guidelines for developers points to the need for planting, and your point about street planting as well, really important in our view for residential areas. Yeah, so it's something we support. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Next question. Some countries with hotter climates have lighter coloured roads and footpaths to prevent heat absorption. Can Waipa do this? Is more power used on heating in winter or cooling in summer? So TC, your comment on this one?
I'll answer the two different questions individually. So the first one around some countries utilise different coloured roads and footpaths to reduce heat absorption. That's more typically found in your quite dense urban environments and cities in America. That's also when they have different types of roading aggregates. They use concrete more than they use asphalt. And it's not something that's really looked at as part of this plan change process, or we'll respond to it if it does come a governor initiative, but it's pretty much out of scope with this plan change. The second one around is greater power usage on heating in winter or cooling in summer. Most definitely in our country, it's in the winter time that's utilised more. We see that with our peak usage and our rates increases from a utility perspective from the company's transmission and making sure that we're getting more money from us. I have been in discussions with Waipa Networks on this in terms of their sort of capacity constraints as we've gone through this process. So they're quite happy with their sort of core infrastructure to supply that demand, but it's their local infrastructure they're worried about in terms of feeding in their new transformers and the lead-in times to get that sort of infrastructure up to scope.
All right, if you just stay there for a moment, Tony. And the following question was, should council be encouraging lighter coloured roofs to reduce heat build-up and therefore power consumption for cooling? Any comment on that?
Yeah, that's not really part of the jurisdiction that we have under the district plan to really focus in on coloured roofs. It's a great initiative if you are looking to look at ways of cooling down your house in the summer. And it may come through as a building code update or a future green initiative for green buildings. There may be some requirements that come through there, but again, that would be out of scope of this plan change.
All right. David, do you have any comment on that one?
No, I think Tony covered it off pretty well. Thank you. Thank you,
All right.
Wayne. Yep.
It's
Thank you.
fine. Do we have a next slide of all the questions, or I'll just start reading them out? Okay, here we go. So can a homeowner be assured that if they want to install solar panels, their house is not shaded by another property for a certain number of hours? I think we've had a similar question on a previous webinar on that. I'm sure Joe's able to respond again on this matter.
I think I can do all of these questions. There are no guarantees that you will not be shaded out. There's currently no guarantees in the district plan that solar panels will not be shaded out. And basically it's outside the scope of the plan change. We do have, our district plan does have rules about height to boundary, to ensure that a certain number of sunlight hours are gained each day. The new medium density standards do reduce that, but we don't know what the impact on sunlight hours would be, if there would be any impact at this stage.
So essentially, Joe, it would be a civil matter between parties.
Yes.
Next question, can council ensure each property has a tree, preferably deciduous, to let winter light in, planted on the property? So you want to talk to that one, Joe?
I can do that. No, we can't ensure that each property has a tree. There are different rules under the medium density standards for outdoor space and outdoor living space. If someone can fit a tree in, that would be awesome, but we would be relying on our street planting and our access to parks and reserves for people to gain access to green spaces.
Thank you. And the next question was about, should council have a ratio of people to parks spaces to ensure there's enough access to nature?
We did, if you go onto our webpage, we did get an independent assessment done of our open spaces and our green infrastructure across Cambridge, Kihikihi and Te Awamutu. There is more than sufficient access to green spaces, and there is no intention to reduce the amount of green space that we have or to allow building to encroach into the town belt around Cambridge. So the green space as it currently stands is being protected under Plan Change 26.
Thank you. I'll just bring TC into this one as well in terms of comment on the car parking on the road. So off-site.
Yeah, that's right. So I suppose it will be looked at case by case basis as well, where we can try to fit car parks and roads, and that will be part of that financial contribution discussions around the local effects on local infrastructure. So it will be looked at case by case, and there may be some means of capturing funding to source additional parks in those berms. But when we look at case by case, we also look at the road corridor widths and see if they can actually be fitted into the actual existing road corridor dimensions. Yeah.
Thank you. And the final question on that slide, should council ensure that every residence within the town boundary has a park that can be accessed in 10 minutes walking. David.
Thanks, Wayne. I think Joe's probably better qualified on this one, given her familiarity with Plan Change 26. But to my mind, Plan Change 26 doesn't address this specifically. And what I would say is that under Plan Change 26, we have, well, not under Plan Change, under the district plan currently, we have a requirement, all new development requires a structure plan, and we do look at the adequate provision of open space parks within those structure plan areas. But now with Plan Change 26, we're talking about a kind of ad hoc infill development, and it's going to be really hard for council to ensure that over time with infill development that we retain that ready access, walking access to park space. Joe mentioned we've got more than enough currently within our towns, which is great. And it will probably be fine with a level of infill development in the short term, but there may come a time in the longer term where we pass a threshold where council will need to consider the provision of additional space. And that's quite hard to do in a retrofitting sense, where you have to, in a sense, demolish buildings to create additional park space because it's all developed up. Yeah, so it's a tricky area, not in the short term, but in the longer term, yes, certainly something we're going to have to monitor. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you for that. Next slide. Will bus routes service the areas of greater intensity housing? Infrastructure question. Tony?
It's certainly something we'll have to factor in with our council's strategy for public transport as we go down this way. But the trouble with, as David just mentioned, with ad hoc infill and intensification, it's very hard to plan when you have a blanket covering everything for intensification. So we'd have to be quite reactive in those bus routes, and it may mean that we have to adjust to suit. So, and we'd likely entail that through our urban mobility planning as well, to make sure that it's around cycle routes and connectivity through those different modes of transport is seamless and linking.
And then just following on there about people have got push bikes or even motorbikes, I suppose, but where can they park them?
Well, I suppose we do have some rules in the district plan, I believe, on commercial zones having provisions for car parks or for cycle parks. So there is elements there where there will be something for commercial zones. There's no provisions under the district plan for on-site residential car parks or those types of means. There will also be able to just, in parks, I suppose, you'll just have them on a bike stand and would look to, through our planning of reserves and infrastructure through that means, provide some facilities for bike parks.
Thank you. And then next questions, Joe, should the soundproofing be increased for high density living?
In an ideal world, yes, personally, I believe soundproofing should be increased. Plan Change 26 is not about the technical nature of building houses close to each other. It's purely to allow for housing intensification to occur. An issue such as soundproofing could be considered in a later plan change that Waipā District Council will be doing that deals with urban design and affordable housing and making livable spaces to live in when you've got a greater number of people living in an area. So it could be something that will be considered in the future by the council.
Joe, just I guess my follow-up question on that is because we do have acoustic insulation requirements on housing, say in a commercial area above the shops, as an example, or close to highways or railway lines and the like. Is this something that somebody could lodge a submission on for this plan change, or is it out of scope?
I do feel you could lodge a submission because we're proposing to keep our existing rules about soundproofing for noise sensitive activities. being state highways, the main trunk line. So if you really wanted to comment on this, a submission would be a good way of doing this, because it would enable you to participate in the discussion moving forward.
Great, thank you. And the final question, if you just remain there, these are the final question that was lodged prior to the webinar. Can we ensure there's a corridor past high density housing for bird life and bee life?
This would be an awesome initiative. Unfortunately, outside the scope of Plan Change 26, but it would fall within the urban design guideline scope of a future plan change that Waipā District Council is hoping to start next year.
Yeah, so I'll just add the point that we have made some changes to our bylaw relating to bees to allow for more accommodation of bee life within our residential areas of our towns, which is obviously really important for them. So no, thank you for that, Joe. And next, I guess, is the questions that have been coming in, and some are quite lengthy. So team, we're going to have to bear with me to read this out if you haven't already had a chance to read them already. So I'll just start cracking into it. First question, do you think it is beneficial for people in rural to submit a submission? So probably one for Joe. I guess there's people in the rural zone to submit a submission on.
I do believe it would be beneficial. It's important to hear from a wider range of Waipa people. Potentially, rural people could be impacted when they start coming into town after housing intensification occurs, and increase in traffic, lack of parking spaces, and all that stuff. It is one way of ensuring that you've got the ability to participate moving forward, but you would have to do your homework to submit on specific provisions in the plan change, and given how long the plan change is and how big the technical reports are, you might not want to do that. So it would be up to the individual person to comment on that and make the decision for themselves.
All right, thank you. If you could just remain there, Joe. Yeah, and I guess I'll just say that we did send the plan change out to all our residents, including our rural zone residents. So we do invite you to comment on the plan change if you feel that you need to do so. The next question is quite a lengthy question, Joe. It's about the character area review.
Okay.
So I'll just sort of read it out. Hopefully you'll get the nub of the points. Appendix 4, it's quite technical. Section 5, it comes down to a page number. Recommendations as completed recommends that some properties are to be afforded heritage registration in its entirety. Has this recommendation completed for Waipā District Council been accepted in full? As the council previously stated, you are looking to establish character clusters noted to define heritage status. Please clarify your intent.
It's very important to realise that a heritage home or building is different to a character building. A character building is based on the look of a building, and sometimes you get 3 or 4 similar style of buildings adjacent to each other, and they create a certain look. We have proposed adding more character homes into character clusters that are currently in the district plan. We are not proposing to add any new heritage item onto our heritage schedule. Given the constraints we had and the time we had for the plan change, there wasn't the ability to do a detailed heritage study and analysis of new heritage items to go on into the plan change and onto the heritage schedule. So the recommendations contained in the character review assessment are just that, they're recommendations. The ones that we've adopted moving forward concern the inclusion of new character homes / buildings into our existing character clusters and character streets.
Okay, thanks for that, Joe. I'm just conscious of time and I just want to get through as many questions as possible here. The second part of the question was about further, the same review recommends in some cases that the front component of the property remains in gardens and unbuilt to retain the heritage value of the house. Is it the council's intent to place controls on the yard, large vegetation to retain this? If so, will council actively manage and maintain the large trees, or will council expect the householder to maintain the trees? Will this result in trees having protection status where it has been recommended the front component of the property remains in garden and unbuilt? Can we clarify that?
We currently have provisions in the district plan around character homes, and if you're in a character cluster area or character street, you do require resource consent. It has not been proposed to add any additional controls. So now the status quo is that the homeowner is responsible for their property and any trees on it. Moving forward, that will not change. They will still be responsible for the upkeep of their property and any trees that they have on that property.
Thank you. Next question, Joe, again, probably more quite specific on the plan change, these questions. How do you identify when the new medium density standards and height in relation to boundary rules apply, e.g. only one residence is built in a staged development? Do all 2 or 3 dwellings need to apply for a building consent at the same time?
I have not thought that far ahead, to be honest. At the moment, none of the medium density residential standards will apply, given that there's qualifying matters over all of the residential areas for Cambridge, Kihikihi and Te Awamutu. I'm not a consents planner, so I'm not sure if you would apply that rule each time a dwelling is built on a property, or whether it would be applicable at building consent time. I am happy to find that out, and we could put an answer on the website, but it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah. So I just reinforce that the new legislative standards do not apply at notification of the plan change. And as we move through the plan change process, depending on where the hearing commissioners end up with that plan change, will depend on the weight that's given to these new legislative requirements. In terms of the building consent, well, I don't think you need to apply for a building consent for the whole 3 dwellings at one time. You can apply for separate building consents, I would have thought. Anyway, we'll try and clarify that a little bit more on the website. Next question, I note you stated the current plan and your proposed plan change response proposes to allow only 2 households on one site. We have a site with a large rear site area that can sustain an additional house to the rear of the section. Under the proposed change, I understand we'll still be able to add an additional unit or new title. Is this the case for a site included in the character cluster? We note that the areas available could sustain 2 households in a new title. Would the council then not permit this action should a new title be capable of sustaining more than 1 household? So Joe, another sort of technical question here relating to numbers of households, what they can do on these sections under the current plan and the plan change.
My understanding, and I would have to get this confirmed, is that a resource consent would be required to add an additional home to the rear of the section, and the things that the council would look at would be how the new building is integrated into the section. Does it take away from the character aspect of the existing home, the existing property? So it's not that an additional dwelling won't be allowed, it's just it would be a different path, and a resource consent would be required.
Thank you for that. The next question is quite interesting, and David, you might want to pop in on this question. So it's talking about urban sprawl effectively. Developing farmland into urban land through the urban sprawl creates higher emissions than higher intensity housing. Infrastructure requirements are as a whole less, not more than low density housing. This can be understood when you consider all the additional roads and services required for low density housing. If you think about the future, places like Hamilton, Auckland struggle with problems due to low density urban sprawl and are now actively trying to get people back into the centres with higher density living. And do we agree?
Good question. Thank you, Wayne.
Good
yes,
question.
happy to respond. Firstly, I think the important thing to stress is that Plan Change 26 applies to both new areas and existing residential areas. So we've got a number of growth cells that provide for additional development, residential development around Tiamutu, Kihiki and Cambridge. And the fact is that the medium density provisions in this plan change would apply to any new development, be it infill or new green, what we call greenfields developments. So I think the days of just what you call sprawl, low density housing are kind of over anywhere in high growth areas in New Zealand, including around our towns. And we have no plans to extend our current growth cell areas. So our current growth cell areas, to our mind, provide for more than enough land for the foreseeable future. And when I talk about that, for the next 30 to 50 years, under current population projections, which we've adopted a high growth scenario. So at this stage, I think we're on the right path. As to the emissions, we're also committed through working with our future-proof partners to a transformation of transport across the sub-region, moving to improving both micro-mobility, because with the higher residential density, we're trying to encourage greater walking within neighbourhoods, access to parks, and better provision for that walking and for cycling. And then in addition to that, with the move away from providing for motor cars as the most common use of transport, we want to transition to more public transport. So way better bus services, both within our towns and connecting our towns to Hamilton in our instance. So looking at quite rapid transit travel between the two, so that it does work, but it requires a big commitment. So we do see the future as being quite transformational with regard to this comment about urban sprawl. Thank you.
David, just to follow up, I guess similar type of question. I'll just skip one and just jump to it. It was really about protecting prime farming land from being swallowed up by housing, and what the council is doing about that. And of course, we know that there's a new national policy statement on high quality soils coming out. Any comments on that?
Briefly? So another really good point. And I think it is something we as council take pretty seriously. And as Wayne said, we know central government's indicated that probably within the next month, they're going to be releasing a national policy statement on highly productive land. And that's all about protecting it from things like urban sprawl. So I think those days are over, frankly, and certainly around our towns, while we do know our current growth cells, are particularly around Cambridge, are on what we call high value soils. This has long been kind of set in plan since 2009, in fact. So we're not looking at extending new areas to those existing growth cells. With this plan change 26, we believe the additional capacity provided for as infill, we've got more than enough capacity. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dave. Joe, just another quick question on character clusters. So this is probably an example somebody's got where they say they note that where an additional dwelling is allowed to the rear of a site within a character cluster is on the basis that is in keeping with the original dwelling. In an instance where an additional dwelling will not be visible from the streetscape, and with this being the case, would the council waive the requirement for the dwelling to be in keeping with the original dwelling? Or would we assess that on a case-by-case basis?
It would be assessed on a case-by-case basis as the resource consent is being processed. So yeah, it would not be one size fits all. It would be assessed depending on what is proposed. I know some character homes have additions on the back, and the additions are quite modern and they can't be seen from the front of the property. So the character aspect of that home is still there. So definitely moving forward, I would expect a case-by-case basis and for discretion to be applied. If it's not visible, potentially it may not have to be in character, but until we're in a position where we have to start processing those resource consents, it's very difficult to give an assurance or any guarantees.
Okay, that's fine, Joe. Can you just stay there for 1 moment? And I guess that's why it's a restricted discretionary activity, isn't it,
Yes.
Joe? And it'd be part of the discretion for consideration.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the next question there was just about where can we then locate the planning maps to define Waipā District Council's character properties clusters, if not as per recommendations provided within the review appendix?
If you go to the Plan Change 26 webpage, I'm pretty sure in the plan change themselves it is maps 58 and 59. So we have drawn up new maps that show the existing character clusters and streets, and it shows the proposed new additions to character clusters and proposed new character clusters. So pretty sure it's 58 and 59 in the plan change.
All right, thank you, Joe. Look, folks, that's comes to the end of all the questions that we have, both submitted before the webinar and during the webinar. We have gone through the hour, and I'm just conscious of people's time. I think at this point, I'd just like to close the presentation. I just thank everybody for their time this evening and coming out and listening to us about Plan Change 26 and asking those questions. If you do have more questions, as I say, please use the information that's been supplied on this webinar and on our website, where you can lodge those comments, and we'll try and get responses back to you. Just like to thank you once again for coming along, and I also like to thank the panel and the team for being available at this time to respond to the questions. So I'll just close the presentation, and thanks very much. Have a good evening.